Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and I am your host of the Right to Read Initiative. Today, I have the honor of having Mr. Rick Moore join me, and he is going to tell us a little bit more about his journey to the right to read. And this is the first of 3 episodes we're going to feature in. So if you're listening and hoping for some information and you don't hear it in this episode, you're just going to have to listen to the following ones. So thank you for joining me today, Rick. How are you?
I'm fine, Kathryn. Pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So where did your interest in reading and the right for reading for individuals to learn how to read began?
It began with the discovery in kindergarten that our son Jeffrey was struggling to learn the basics of reading, even remembering a letter of the alphabet. So we had been fervent believers in reading to our kids, including Jeffrey. And with the older kids in the family, the kids older than Jeff, they just magically almost learned to read. And so when I can think back to lying in bed with Jeff and him loving to be read to, engaging with the picture books, and but when he started kindergarten, you could see his self-esteem and his willingness to engage with books diminish overnight. And what happened, of course, in hindsight, is that he saw all the majority of the kids in his classroom doing what our other kids had in their experience of just magically learning to be able to decipher these symbols on the page. And he couldn't do that. Almost immediately for a child like that, now we know, that begins to affect their self-esteem. And it doesn't matter how much you tell that child that they are smart, that they are just as capable as the next child of learning things. When a child looks around at his peers and see them all of them doing this magical thing that he can't do, that defines their place in the pecking order of the classroom, that's what hurts a parent the most. It's you start out, your happy child who's always been great about making friends goes into this environment, and you see the harm almost immediately. So we were Michelle, my wife, was a particularly engaged parent, and she would go to the kindergarten class, volunteer, and was in early on, she was having discussions with the teacher. What's going on? Why isn't he? And because Jeff was a December child, right away the wait and see reaction of the school was coming back at us. Wait and see. At the end of kindergarten, we were so worried about his lack of progress that we had a big discussion with the school team. Shouldn't we be holding him back? He's a December child. And all the advice we got was, no, he's got his peer group, let him go on with his peer group. He's young. A lot of kids have a delay. Right away, they're promoting the wait and see attitude. So we go on. And things start to get worse. And one of the things, besides the obvious indication that his self-esteem was being destroyed, was that he started to develop headaches. And occasionally he would go out of class to a dark room, have a little lie down, and so on. So they were aware of it, although later on they testified they weren't aware of it. They were aware, because we were always in constant communication. We were constantly asking the school-based team, what can we do? And at one point, they said, so they'd done testing. They'd done testing kindergarten, where he was one of two that they deemed at risk. They did the standard screening tests that they do. And at
How
one
did that?
point they said, why don't you privately engage in Ort Gillingham tutor?
So let's just go back a step. So do either you or your wife have a background in education? Or are you only basing your concern for Jeff off your experience with your older children?
Neither of us have a background in education. I was a bus driver at the time. I eventually retired as a bus driver. Michelle was a secretary. When we met, she was a dental assistant. However, before Michelle and I got engaged with our struggle with Jeff and slowly educated ourselves about what his experience was, we came to realize that on Michelle's side of the family, there were kids that had struggled. Jeff has an older cousin, the same age as my older daughter, who's 10 years older than Jeff, who dropped out in grade 10. We came to realize she was dyslexic, and she got tired of banging her head against the wall. But we had not learned, we had not yet educated ourselves about what was happening. All the bad things happened to Becky. So whenever I talk, I'm getting ahead of myself, but whenever I talk about Jeff's success, I always have to juxtapose that with Becky. Becky, all the bad things have happened to Becky. She drops out, she gets into drugs, she gets into the sex trade. Why? Because she had never been able to build a single building block that leads to success. Those early experiences of being able to do this or that or the other. Always she was a failure in school. And what happens to those kids? I'm really getting to myself, but I think it's important that because to explain how it took Jeff to motivate us to get educated. And for one reason or another, that hadn't happened with them. We later found out that there was that Michelle's siblings may very likely have been learning disabled, but of course were never diagnosed. We know for a fact that Becky's younger brother has a learning, he's not quite as severely dyslexic as Jeff, but he combines that with ADHD, which makes for probably his situation be even more difficult than Jeff. I can talk more about Reese because I can later on, because it's an example of how once we had educated ourselves about Jeff's struggles and became more the expert than the teachers that we came up against, we were able to transfer everything we learned in order to have to achieve success with Jeff to Reese. And actually, Reese has followed almost right down Jeff's path, to the extent that he followed Jeff to BCIT and became a plumber. And when Jeff left plumbing to become a fireman, Reese took his job for that company. Just an amazing example of how educating yourself as a parent can lead to great outcomes, even when the school system has essentially abandoned. But I will say this, my mom was a teacher.
Mhm.
And I truly believe she was a gifted teacher. She had to quit because she had me in those days. You got married, you had a kid, you were kicked out of the system. The reason I mentioned my mom is that we were very fortunate that my mom and dad did daycare for us. We never had to put our kids in daycare. Jeff was the oldest of their grandkids. He almost immediately was followed by his three cousins. During the time that mom and dad looked after their grandkids, once Jeff started kindergarten in grade 1, he deferred in any argument or disagreement. He would immediately defer to the opinions of his younger cousin because he didn't feel like he was worthy. His ideas were worthy. His thinking was worthy. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until we took him out of the public school and put him in Kenneth Gordon that my parents were among the first to notice that suddenly, and I mean, before we did, because they were there every day with, seeing the four of the kids together, he started standing up for himself. And so as much as putting him in Kenneth Gordon and finally seeing a remediation method for learning to read work, the most important thing and the thing that happened first was the beginning of the process to bring him back to a feeling of being worthy, of being smart. Finally, understanding that what we've been telling him was true. He is smart. And why did he think that? Because now he was with a group of peers who he could see were cool, smart kids, but who all just happened to learn the same way he did. And that there was a method that found the pathway. Why is it called multisensory? They find a pathway. They find a pathway that works for that individual. That's a long answer to your question about where I came from, but it's so important for parents to understand that it is possible to learn the jargon of the education system. And it doesn't take long to educate yourself so that you are actually more of authority speaking about learning disabilities than the teacher, especially in Jeff's day, because they taking any courses in their at the university about special education was purely an elective. That changed a little bit, but not much.
So we heard up to the end of kindergarten, and then there was a jump to Kenneth Gordon. What happened in between there? The school recommended going for a private psychoeducational assessment. And at that time, I'm guessing it was about $1,500 to get that done.
So what happened before he got assessed was that the childhood migraines had increased in severity. Mm-hmm. And we, on our own initiative, took him to a neurologist. And the neurologist wrote a letter to the school saying that if you deal with his learning difficulties, that very likely will solve the problem of the headache. It was that evidence of harm from a doctor that we presented to the school that immediately triggered a full psycho-ed assessment. He had had one before, because even by the end of grade 1, they knew that he was at risk. But they didn't do the IQ portion because it's too young. That was the excuse. But of course, without the IQ portion, nothing that didn't trigger any services, any additional LEC, and certainly not the diagnostic center, which was the reading center. Then, after the neurologist, because we knew how long these tests could take, 1 year, 2 year waiting list, we first went to North Shore Health and we got an assessment from them. But I think because we demonstrated harm, they have to respond to a red flag like that. I mean, the public school system, or they would risk liability. So he went completely off the priority list for a full psych ed to getting them. And the full psych ed by the school psychologist showed that he was very severe. And the result from that psych ed test was that he was put on the wait list for the diagnostic center, which was the reading center in North Van that had existed for 20 years. The irony is that we sued the North Van School District, which is one of the most enlightened districts historically about reading and so on. They had the diagnostics. Of course, the diagnostic center was just a 3 to 4 month pullout program. Now we know that would not have been nearly enough. Even if, when they come out of the diagnostic center, if the in-class supports had been there, which of course they aren't, and they still aren't to this day, it wouldn't have been enough. But we didn't know that. Always, whatever they suggested, Orton Gillingham tutor, whatever, we were all in. Yes, let's try that. Let's try that. So we get the psych ed test. We go to the school-based meeting. So that's the school psychologist, the LAC, the principal, everybody, expecting to hear the wonderful news that he has been accepted because of the psych ed exam, showing how severe he was. He's been accepted into the program. Bad news, just days before it's announced that they're shutting down the diagnostic center because of cuts to funding. The school district was arguing, oh, we got this contract, you know, that it requires money to this support and that. They're told that they could, you know, cut bands and strings or the outdoor school or whatever. In the end, nothing was cut but the diagnostic center. So here's the amazing thing that happened and what sets the facts of our case apart from, and what is the bad thing that turned out to be lucky is that in the meeting, the school psychologist did the right thing. She said that because the only resource in the school district for intense remediation is closed, the only place you're going to get intense remediation is if you put them in Kenneth Gordon. We'd never heard of Kenneth Gordon, had no idea. I am a supporter of public education because my mom was a teacher. It was, we're a family of modest means. I'm a bus driver. She's a secretary. There's no way we would have contemplated a private school. But the survival of your kid is at stake. So we remortgaged our house. We had to go on bended knee to ask for bursaries from the school. But it's because the school psychologist made that recommendation. That is what becomes key to us winning, eventually winning in the Supreme Court. However, that advice was not in writing. And what the Human Rights Tribunal pointed out was that at every school-based meeting up until that one, things were in writing. Mysteriously, there is absolutely no written record of what went on in that meeting. And so when they got on the stand, they denied all sorts of things. When we got to Kenneth Gordon, so we see all these amazing improvements in Jeff's self-esteem. He's learning to read, it's obvious. When he started grade 5, his second year at Kenneth Gordon, I got to thinking about the fact that most of the kids going there were coming from families that might well have been able to afford to put their kid in a private school, might have chosen to put their kid in a private school. We could barely afford it. And at that time, Kenneth Gordon was way cheaper than it is today. Well, Kenneth Gordon is not even the same school as it was then. But so I started to get really angry thinking about all the kids that must be falling by the wayside because their parents didn't get the advice that that was an option. If they had, they couldn't afford it. Or maybe they came from a family that had LD in it that The idea of negotiating with the school system for services was terrifying. They didn't have the schooling to be able to advocate for their kid. What about all these kids falling by the wayside?
Yeah.
And when I began this journey, wasn't thinking that I was going to be the one tilting at windmills, going out and getting a roller. I started phoning around, trying to get somebody engaged in taking up the fight. At one point, I called the ombudsman. I thought, this is an obvious case for the ombudsman. And everybody said, no, that's very sympathetically. We understand that this is, not just, but it's not in our remit. But each one would give me another phone number to call. And eventually I called, that led me to community legal assistance. And to this day, I say, the only thing I can really take credit for, besides making my child my number one priority, is his safety and preserving his potential in life. Besides doing what any good parent would do, the one thing I can take credit for is when I went to community legal assistance, I was able to convince the person who became our lawyer for the whole 16 years, Francis Kelly, who turned out to be the foremost legal expert in disability law. I convinced her that we had a case she could win. And it turned out she had been looking for a case where the facts were so strong that she had a chance, because she knew it was going to be a really, really tough case to win. Turned out LDABC had been approaching them and trying to get them to take it up as a systemic issue. But she had said to them, I have to have the facts. And the fact that they closed the diagnostic center without any plan to replace it, it was strictly a financial decision. The fact that the school psychologist had been the one to tell us, there's no more help for Jeff in the public system, you better put him in the private school. All these became the facts that decided the case.
Of course. Now I want to take a moment and just let listeners know, because we do have a broad listenership. So you and I reside in the Greater Vancouver Regional District. So that is a metropolitan center in British Columbia surrounding the city of Vancouver. Now,
I live there and sometimes in Victoria, but
right.
Yes. But
at the time of this case,
we lived in North Vancouver.
Yes, the time that your child went to this school. So Jeff and I actually both attended Kenneth
amazing
at the same time,
That's right.
Which is a really cool fact, coincidence, whatever you want to call it. And so I can speak quite well to what was happening at Kenneth Gordon during this time period. So it was in a small little school with 4 classrooms. Each of these classrooms had 14 students in them. Now, the day was divided into 5 one-hour blocks. Each student at this school received 1 hour of Orton Gillingham tutoring a day and small group math instruction. So while half the class was at tutoring, the other half of the class did the math. And there was often a second teacher to divide it into a group of 3 and a group of 4. So it was highly intensive instruction. It was the 90s, so there weren't iPads, there weren't laptops, but there were computers in every classroom. And there was a computer lab that we had access to. And that was another forefront that they recognized this was a skill that we needed to do. Now, the student body, these 54 students were coming from the various areas around the Lower Mainland. And there were buses contracted, the Handy Dart buses, which is a bus service for individuals with special needs and the elderly. They were contracted to take these children to school. For me, it was an hour commute each way to this school. And I was from Vancouver, and so there was the largest number of students from Vancouver, and there were 14 of us going to this school. Now, there were families that had the money, and, you know, sending a child to Kenneth Gordon wasn't a huge inconvenience, but there were also the families that, like you, went for mortgages and bursaries, and their kid knew that, look, this is all we have to help you, and we're doing the best that we can. And, you know, the story about Jeff gaining confidence, very quickly recognizing that he wasn't alone, so common for kids of that generation and that time period at Kenneth Gordon School. It saved so many lives.
That's right. But the thing that made me mad when he started grade 5 was the anger that it's still a tiny percentage of the LD kids out there, because we know that when it comes to special needs students, the 80%, that's just a figure we know, because we know there's 80% of the kids, people in prisons that are illiterate and various other needs. We don't know this because the ministry conspires, I'm going to use that word, to keep these kids invisible. A number of education ministers ago, and there's been an average of new education minister every year or two, there was one, Abbott, who said, I am going to screen every kid entering the public education system to find out if they're at risk. And somebody got to him, somebody within the ministry said, no, this is my search, because he's promoting this, and then suddenly he isn't, and you never hear another word about it again. And when he said that, I was so thrilled, because I thought, now we will know the actual numbers of kids entering the system at risk. Maybe not dyslexic, maybe just at other reasons to be at risk for reading failure, but the majority will have LD. We will know. We won't be guessing anymore. Is it 5%, 10%, 20%? We'll know what's coming into the system. I am convinced that somebody said, you don't want to do that, because then we'll know, and we'll have an obligation to track these kids. We'll have to audit for success. They didn't want to do that. That's my cynical opinion after all these years of advocating.
Well, and in British Columbia, we do have assessments that are administered in grade 4 and in grade 8 to kind of act as a thermometer to see how students are doing. Now, the one thing that isn't publicized is that the vast majority of students that have a learning disability diagnosed at that time are exempt from taking this because of having an individualized education plan in place. So they are not required to take this.
Another thing, I'll just jump in one quick second, is that by grade 4, there's also a number that have been removed from the education system and put into private schools. They don't count for that either.
No. So that's important to recognize, because what the province of British Columbia is using to judge the effectiveness of teaching isn't assessing the kids that really need to be considered. And there's also, students who struggle with reading and school issues often have a lot of absences because they don't want to go to school. That's, they're going to be forced to do something that they know they can't do all day, repeatedly. And, having the stomach ache or the headache because they can't do it. It is too much for their little bodies to cope.
I maintain that the number one thing that kids with learning disabilities learn in school is how to become invisible. And
Mhm.
they can do it Jeff just became the quietest kid in the class. He did it by having friends. He was lucky he had friends because that prevented him from getting bullied as being different, which happens. But also they would butt in and do his work for him as much as possible. And so the majority are like Jeff. Another strategy that a percentage of them, or they'll become the class clown. So for them, the strategy is to be distracting. You're being asked to do something academic, then you just create chaos in the classroom by being very few are behavioral problems. Very few. Maybe a kid like my nephew Reese, who combines LD with ADHD. Well, he almost got expelled. I had to go there and with my sister-in-law, this is one of the very first times I used the decision. I went in there, I slapped the case down on the table and said to the principal, you've never done anything for this kid, and now you're going to expel him? And instead of expelling him, because they do fear, if you can demonstrate you know the law and the rights of this child, and you have the jargon and the language, and you don't go over the line and become a problem parent, you don't drop F-bombs, they will move. So instead of expelling him, they put him in the apprenticeship program. And that's where he began his journey to follow Jeff. It's always, I have a vivid memory of that moment because it's one of the first times I was able to use the case for an individual. But we're talking 1 out of 1,000, you know, even those of us that learn how to use the case can't help but think, because we didn't win the systemic case and create change from the top down, all we can do is fight this on a one kid at a time basis. Always thinking of the kids that aren't getting help and are still falling by the wayside.
And it is horrible that we are still dealing with on a regular basis. I mean, I started the advocacy work that I do because I truly feel that no child should ever go through what I went through. I had a similar experience to Jeff, only I had severe bullying and verbal and physical abuse from the school on top of that. And it's not something that is acceptable in any shape or form. And it really saddens me that today, you know, a couple decades later, it's still happening. And I know this because I have 3 children, 2 of which have learning disabilities, and their needs are not being met by the school. We are fortunately in a position that we can get the tier 3 support outside of the school, but it's extremely expensive, and it is having a huge impact on what we're able to do as a family outside of, you know, sustaining our children.
It becomes the sole focus of the family because it's so hard and it takes so much energy.
Yes.
Yeah, so people may be listening in because they think of the Moore case as this, you know, successful battle that set a precedent. It's true. It set a precedent for one child. My greatest disappointment is that I began the court case as a systemic complaint. Jeff was already in the setting that was giving him a chance at success and preserving his potential as a human being. It was always about the other kids, the ones that I saw as falling through the cracks. That's what made me really angry. So when we go to the BC Human Rights Tribunal, so it takes 2.5 years to get there because of all the hurdles they put in our way, and we have to go to the BC Supreme Court to get it ruled as a systemic complaint. And then when it's clear to the district that we are actually going to go to the Human Rights Tribunal, they offer a settlement to us. But I couldn't take it because by that time I'd been on the radio. Your mom had got, you know, was making me talking about me, hopefully we could make change that we've been trying to achieve for decades. And so I couldn't let down all the people that had been given hope. So I didn't take the offer from the district to settle. So now we go to the tribunal. That took another 5 years to present the case because we did. So we were criticized as having turned this case into a Royal Commission on Education.
All right, hold on. I just want to pause you right there because on Wednesday, we're going to go into the case in detail. Okay. So let's focus a little bit.
So I won't go into detail, but I will say that the failure in the Supreme Court to win the systemic case, the case that the province had discriminated against all special needs kids, but especially LD kids, systemically, the failure to do that means that the ministry now feels immune. They were already protected by the shield of all these districts taking responsibility. They were already only auditing how do you spend the check, but not for how services succeed. They were already failing in identifying kids across the province, making sure services were equal across the province. Now they feel totally immune. And the districts also feel immune because they know that, well, the Human Rights Tribunal won't take a case like ours now. They will force parents into mediation, and the parents will be forced to take some minor adjustment in the kids' school experience, you know, what's available to that kid at that particular moment, which is limited. So, yes. So when you talk about your experience, so the reason I bring this up is when you talk about your experience now with your children, what you're dealing with is worse than what we dealt with. So we start our case. There is such a thing as severe learning disability. If you are designated severely learning disabled, you qualify for targeted funding, or that student does, and the school must spend the money. One of the first things they do after we get to the tribunal, they eliminate no such thing as severely learning disabled in their eyes. Just the other day, we find out they're getting rid of the Q designation. Once again, even more invisible. So I understand the public school system is swamped with visible special needs that they have to deal with: autism, fetal alcohol, all kinds of things, that behavioral, all these visible things. They conspire, I believe, to keep LD invisible. And yet it would be the simplest thing. The simplest thing. It wouldn't cost them anything but startup costs to have a model within each district based on like a French immersion model, where you would have one school in each district and maybe be 150 kids, 200 kids who would get a kind of Kenneth Gordon, but delivered in the public school system. It doesn't cost any more to train a teacher to teach Orton Gillingham than it does to teach physics. You just make a commitment in the universities, we're going to teach this, and then they will pass it on to the students. So that is not it. Maybe a startup cost, that's all. They are in the system. They are being babysat, but they're there. Money is being spent to have the babysitter. That's a bit crude way to describe it, but that's what we saw. And but they keep doing these things that make the kids more invisible. And because they now feel immune, there's nothing stopping them.
Mhm.
The court said the Moore decision means that what do they call it? A special education is not a dispensable luxury for those with severe learning disabilities. It's the ramp that provides access. So they say all the right things. Just like in the civil rights movement, they say, okay, the slaves are emancipated. But they don't invest it any more than when they close Riverview or Essendale. They say, oh, no more One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But they don't invest in the community to make that move. That work. Same with inclusion. Been going on for about the same length of time, decades. They don't invest in, it's just lip service. It's just a word that became politically correct. Oh, everything will be in the classroom. That's not what inclusion means, but that's what they make it out to mean. Actually, inclusion is a continuum of services
Based on the student. And
individual need of the student. Yeah.
For the severely dyslexic individuals or the ones that have significant reading disabilities, an inclusive classroom isn't an inclusive model for them.
That's right.
And one thing that I didn't really touch on with the Kenneth Gordon thing, I did mention that all these kids are being bussed in, but that isolation isn't the right word. But at school, you have these friends that you enjoy spending time with. Maybe you talk to them over the hardline phone. Instant messaging wasn't around yet. But it's only at school because it's very difficult for parents to, arrange times to get together after school if they're not living in the same location. So you don't have the same school teams because you can't get the kid to school early or pick them up late. The bus system that was scheduled for that didn't work because it was a very remote place. It's not like you could take public transit to get there. And so while you made some good friendships and had that, it's not like you got to see those friends at home and on the weekend. Some kids were lucky in that on their bus or in their community, they had someone that was the same age, living in the same area that they could do stuff with. But that's where the importance of having those community-based schools. So maybe, there's 4 schools that feed into one school focusing on intervention for the individuals with learning disabilities. And yes, there are some students that are on the mild or less severe end of the spectrum of learning disabilities that can benefit from what is currently happening in the schools. And that's great. That's wonderful. But we need to make sure there's something for those that don't.
Yeah. It's funny because since 2012, when we won in the Supreme Court, of course, my first feeling was one of elation because I just think, oh, look at everything we've won. And then the reality that we didn't, because we didn't win the systemic complaint, the province now feels even more immune than it did. But every once in a while, something will happen where either I will use the case to benefit one kid, or I'll hear through the grapevine that somebody else is using the case. And here's a very funny story. I'll be speaking at BC CPAC on the 5th because I play pickleball with a group of people. And one day I'm wearing a t-shirt that says Reynolds High School, where my wife was the secretary a year or so ago. This guy who I play with, I've been playing with him for a while. He says, oh, what's with the shirt? I say, oh, it turns out he worked in the Victoria School District. So I start playing again, and I should ask him what he did. His name is John Gateman. He was the Victoria superintendent. So my normal experience so what I always do in a situation like that, oh, have you heard of the Moore case? And experience has taught me that usually I can see this defensive shell closing. Oh no, this guy, he's going to put me on the spot. And they get all defensive. And John, he blew me away by saying, are you the Rick Moore? Because since he retired, he's come over from the dark side, as I can't help but think of it. And in his role as CEO of BCCPAC, he goes around the province using the court case to go to bat for kids, kids that need special education and aren't getting it or being shut out. And he wins half the time. And if he loses because the parents have not kept the paper trail. So I just want to say, if that's wonderful for me to see it being used, to know it can be used and can help a few kids here and there. But in order for it to work, parents must educate themselves and they must keep a paper trail. Every bit of correspondence, even if it's a verbal phone call, make your notes, be able to show where every red flag presented itself and their response to it. Because the other reason we won our court case is that's what we did. So there were junctures when they claimed in court that we had never said this or it's a different timeline. And each time a piece of paper was able to be slapped down in front of them that proved, that gave our story credibility. And what really robbed their story of credibility was when push came to shove, there is no paper trail. They didn't keep a record. And another funny story is, it has to do with Kenneth Gordon. We heard from parents when we were going there that you could claim the tuition as a medical expense. The catch-22 is you have to have a doctor's recommendation that this is the only thing that is going to help your kid medically. Well, first of all, the school psychologist didn't put it in writing. Secondly, you're not thinking about that. You're just thinking about trying the next thing that is going to give you hope that your child will survive school. And so when we hear this, okay, we apply to get the tuition as a medical expense, and we're denied because we don't have this pre-existing thing. So I phoned up the school psychologist. So not only did she do what a lot of school psychologists wouldn't have done and recommend Kenneth Gordon, but she agrees to talk to the CRA appeals officer. And on the phone, she says, yes, Jeff is the most severe she's ever seen. And yes, she did say that Kenneth Gordon was the only thing left with the closure of the diagnostic center. She didn't have to do that. And what happened was the lawyers for the district made her and the LAC teacher sign an affidavit saying, oh, it was one of many recommendations. I really got mad when she signed that affidavit. I understand why. She's between a rock and a hard place. She thinks she's doing good work and she wants to keep doing the good work, so she has to sign the affidavit. But I went to CRA, and through Freedom of Information, I got the transcript of the phone call, and there it was in black and white. Yes, Kenneth Gordon is the only thing. So tell that long story, one, because some bad things turn out to be good, but number two, the most important advice, keep a paper trail.
Yes, of course. Now let's continue the story, because obviously Jeff didn't stay in grade 5 forever. And Kenneth Gordon only went to grade 7 at the time. So what happened once he reached the end point at Kenneth Gordon? How was he feeling? How were you feeling? And what did you do?
So we knew, of course, by this time that he was first percentile because of all the testing. But more than that, we were so relieved to see the happy child that entered kindergarten, to get that happy child back, to know that he was in the right place. So we were really, really worried that putting him back in the public school system would undermine all that progress. So we we said we said to Kenneth Gordon, you must be absolutely honest with us. Will he survive being put back in the public school system? And they said, because he is so severe, that there's a very good possibility that it would be undermined, be put back into a place that wasn't going to give him the accommodations he needed, or extra time, or all the things that we know that you are entitled to actually out in the real world with once you're diagnosed. So with that recommendation, we went to Fraser Academy, which of course even twice as expensive as Kenneth Gordon. But we were really happy to do that because what more, I mean, buying toys, or there's nothing that's going to, you can spend your money on that is going to give you as much reward as the happiness of your child. So, and we don't want to waste all that money we've already spent by undermining it, but putting it back in the mix. So that he went to Fraser Academy and continued to succeed. But about grade 10, he kind of hit the wall a little bit. And I think it coincided with, things that happen in adolescence. And at one point, he had a little mini breakup. Had to do with his breakup with his first girlfriend. Anyway, what I learned from that is the hurt that is done to a child in kindergarten, grade 1, stays with them for life. And it doesn't matter how much muscle and scar tissue you put on top of that, it can still be ripped off. And as a kid in grade 10, he didn't yet have as much muscle and scar tissue that he has today. And that's all it took, a breakup with his first girlfriend. But it was very quickly overcome. I think because he knew his reality was and from that time on, he went on to win the award for the most improved student by grade 12, the most improved student in the school. But he had not really expressed any particular goal, become this, become that, except it was always his dream to be a fireman. And I said to him, everybody that's into fitness, and by this time, Jeff was really into fitness. I think because it's an individual thing, as opposed to like a team sport, I think you'll find that on average, most kids who struggle in school at a young age, unless they're, unbelievable athlete, gravitate to individual sport. He went because they're not comparing themselves to, their other teammates who more than likely were in the classroom, who they already feel like second class to. He pursued a lot of individual sports, weightlifting, really worried about the weightlifting, thinking of steroids and all that stuff. But then he got into boxing. Oh, that's something, watching your kid get to boxing. So he became a real fitness nut, and that combined with his dream of being a fireman. I said to him, it is the in job for everybody in the fitness. You've got to have some kind of post-secondary, either university or trade. Why don't you take plumbing? Because that, I thought, was most analogous to firefighting. You deal with water and pipes and all that stuff. But I'm not handy. It was a complete shot in the dark. He might have been a klutz, but he turned out that BCIT has a really good disability resource department, and they stand by the lip service that all these institutions pay to inclusion. They really do. And it's a hands-on learning environment. It's an apprenticeship, so a lot of it is learned on the job. And for 10 years, he graduates, he gets his Red Seal. Oh, that's a journey, because the Red Seal exam is a national, gives you a national ticket. And well, always the question is, how do you ask for accommodations? Will they hold that against you? And so on. Anyway, he goes to write his red seal, which is the ticket. It's all everything in schooling is, but get that ticket so that you can go and then learn on the job, basically, whatever you're doing. But what threw him was, instead of the BC code book, they put down the national code book, which is virtually the same, but different format. That was enough to throw it.
Mm-hmm.
He was allowed to have his mom as a reader and so on. So they did. Anyway, what happened was he failed the Red Seal, and we went back to the head of the Disability Resource Department at BCIT, said, well, they threw him by giving this thing. Here's an example. That guy, Derek McLaughlin, the head of the BCIT Resource Department, went to bat. And you know, usually you fail, you got to wait months and months. Convince them that by putting this code book that he didn't recognize in front of him, they'd throw him. And he was allowed to use the BC code book almost in a test that they allowed almost within days. And he passed by the skin of his teeth, but he passed. So he had that ticket. He went out into the work world as a journeyman plumber. Story doesn't end there. Within the apprenticeship program, there's no guarantee you'll get a company that will accommodate your learning differences. So he went through about 3 that didn't treat him very well. Meanwhile, my wife Michelle, she gets him into the union, and the union eventually gets him on with this company, Stevens Plumbing, which with a boss that really could see potential in Jeff and could look beyond, you know, his difficulty, you know, when you're writing reports or whatever. And so he was a journeyman plumber for 10 years. All the time, he's doing everything you need to do to become a fireman. So it's, you know, you're volunteering and you're taking courses. It's expensive. I was thinking, oh, I hope he's not banging his head against the wall, you know, and he's going to be incredibly crushed by not getting this thing. And really worried about the first hurdle, which is this humongous test. It's like an aptitude, IQ, psych ed, everything test. But he would just keep taking practice tests online and studying and everything. And he passed it. I must have been selling him short, because I really feared that it would crush him not getting this thing. But you know why he became a fireman? Because in his volunteering at the fire department, guys came to know that he was a true expert in fitness. He knew diet and everything just from his interest in it. And they would come and work out with him. And when the selection process became subjective, these guys put in the good for him. And he not only got his dream job, but he got it in the fire hall closest to where he lives. So it's like he won the lottery on top of the lottery. We are so incredibly lucky. But once again, as soon as I have that thought, I think about what about all the other ones that haven't been so lucky. I still, to this day, I can easily get angry and I can easily get on my soapbox. So when you invite me to talk, I can't resist the soapbox.
Of course. Well, and I'm really excited about our next conversation, because we're going to do a deep dive into that case that made you the Rick Moore, right? The one that people know about across the country if they've had any experience with dealing with a child or someone that has a specific learning disability who is not getting the support that they need to succeed. And I really look forward to going on a deeper dive with you, because I'm very familiar with the case from, you know, what I've heard from my mother, who helped in various aspects through the case along the journey. I've read it, obviously, a few times, but actually having that guided tour from someone who was in it as the parent, making that fight for their child, now being a parent who feels so strongly about this issue. And especially since last year, we had the Ontario Human Rights Commission public inquiry called The Right to Read. Look at it and use your case as an example.
Well, that it gives me, when I heard about the report, it gave me great hope that would be a way to push this forward. Because, like I say, I've been so disappointed, but that every once in a while we get these glimmers of hope.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's always tempered by the fact that the provinces will change the rule to keep the status quo. They really don't want they don't want to fight the teachers union, put down the teachers union. They became an intervener in our case eventually. They did a 180 to do that because originally they thought we were turning the clock back to warehousing kids and stuff. They didn't get it at all. But then when they realized that it was about all special needs kids, not just kids with autism. So I really am looking forward to it.
Wonderful. And I think it's important to recognize the changes that we're asking for have universal benefit.
Right.
Not just for the severely learning disabled student. It's going to support every student within the school for teachers to have this knowledge and understanding, not necessarily Orton Gillingham, but pedagogy founded in the science of reading or structured literacy, understanding what cognitive neuroscience has learned about how the brain learns how to read it and going forward with that.
Yeah, it's amazing that essentially they're still defending whole language in the public education.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.